By the time we hit about 6,500 years ago, Neolithic farmers had already spread themselves across pretty much every corner of Europe. From the Aegean all the way out to the Atlantic, folks were busy planting familiar crops like wheat and peas, and they were raising animals, sheep, pigs, cattle, the whole deal. The older hunter-gatherer groups who had once roamed freely across Europe were pushed out toward the edges and were getting close to fading away completely. But then, something shifted after roughly 4,500 BC. Most of us grow up thinking Europe's early story was a straight, simple path. Hunter-gatherers turned into farmers, stone tools eventually gave way to bronze and then iron, and that was that. But newer genetic studies have thrown a wrench in that tidy picture. Turns out the story isn't nearly that straightforward. Those early hunter-gatherers, people who'd lived here since the end of the Paleolithic, didn't just vanish when farming rolled in. In fact, thousands of years after the first farmers arrived from the Near East, traces of those old European hunter-gatherer groups began popping back up in the DNA of later communities. And it wasn't only their ancestry making a comeback. A surprising number of male bloodlines from early farming groups were actually replaced by hunter-gatherer lineages. Researchers now call this surprising pattern the late Neolithic hunter-gatherer resurgence. And honestly, I find it one of the most fascinating chapters in Europe's prehistoric story. It really challenges that popular idea that Europe saw total population replacements, with no real continuity between the Mesolithic people and those who arrived later. Instead, it hints at a far richer and more connected story. This resurgence is, in a way, a powerful reminder of how resilient those early hunter-gatherers truly were. It's only because of modern ancient DNA research that we even know this resurgence happened. And that's part of why, in this video, I teamed up with MyHeritage. For a short time, you can pick up one of their DNA kits for an incredibly low price, just €25 or pounds depending on where you live, if you use my link and code. Honestly, I've never seen an Ancestry DNA kit offered this cheap. So if you've been curious about digging into your roots, this is the moment to grab one using my link while the discount's still active. You might remember when I partnered with MyHeritage before and showed the results of my own ethnicity estimate. Their system has been updated again. Now version 2.5, giving even more detail. I'm a British guy with an Irish grandparent, and my updated report lines up with that. Plus it adds new ethnicities and reference panels for even clearer results. But my favorite feature they've rolled out is something called Ancient Origins. It lets you compare your DNA to specific ancient populations from different eras. When I checked out my breakdown for the Bronze Age, split between two ancient groups, I came out 59% Neolithic farmer and 41% Western steppe herder. And you can look at these breakdowns for several time periods. For what we're talking about today, the most useful version compares your ancestry to major ancient West Eurasian populations. It's a pretty incredible way to connect with our distant past on a personal level. With my code DAN25, you not only lock in that crazy low 25 unit price, you also get a free 30-day trial, free shipping, and full access to the Ancient Origins tool. There's a lot more included too, way more than I can cover here. If you want to explore your own ancient origins, just follow the link in the description box or scan the QR code on screen, and use coupon code DAN25 to grab the kit at that amazingly low price. Big thanks to MyHeritage for sponsoring the video. Back at the end of the Upper Paleolithic, when glaciers covered northern Europe, the continent's hunter-gatherers pulled back into warmer southern pockets, places like Iberia or the Balkans. Then, around 11,700 years ago, the ice began to melt away, and those groups started to spread out again, reclaiming the land from those refuges. Pretty quickly, they adjusted to the new landscapes that opened up. Archaeologists call these folks Mesolithic societies, the Middle Stone Age people, living after the Paleolithic and before the Neolithic. These Mesolithic hunter-fisher-foragers learned to thrive in all kinds of environments across Europe. They caught fish in rivers and along the coasts, hunted animals like red deer and wild boar, and foraged for nuts, especially hazelnuts, and berries throughout the forests. They also depended on plenty of other resources, things like antlers and, most importantly, good stones such as flint, which they shaped into their tools. Today, geneticists have examined hundreds of ancient individuals and sorted them into different population groups. The biggest category is what we call the Western hunter-gatherers, or WHG, a clear genetic cluster stretching from Iberia all the way up to the Baltic. Farther east, researchers identified a separate group with its own ancestry, known as the Eastern Hunter-Gatherers or EHG. These groups didn't stay isolated, though. They interacted and intermarried where their regions overlapped, blending to different degrees and forming a kind of gradual gradient between them. Up in Scandinavia, this mixed population became distinct enough to earn its own label, Scandinavian Hunter-Gatherers, or SHG. Then, somewhere after about 7000 BC, farming arrived in Europe, starting in the Aegean after being carried over from Anatolia. From there, it spread outward in two major paths, one hugging the Mediterranean coast all the way to Iberia, and the other moving through the Balkans and into Central Europe. This movement signaled a new lifestyle built around raising livestock and growing domesticated crops. Archaeologists watched this shift unfold as new types of pottery, tools, houses, settlements, and burial customs spread across Europe, gradually overtaking the older hunter-gatherer world. But how exactly that huge transition played out was debated for a long time. For decades, scholars argued between two big ideas. One theory claimed that farmers physically migrated from Anatolia into Europe, bringing their crops, culture, and genes with them. The other theory suggested that the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers living in Europe simply learned these new techniques from their neighbors, adopting farming gear and crops but remaining the same people genetically. And of course, there were plenty of researchers who believed the truth probably lay somewhere between those two extremes. By the time we got into the 21st century, most experts leaned toward the idea that many hunter-gatherer groups adopted farming after interacting with incoming Neolithic farmers. Then, after around 2015, everything changed with what people now call the ancient DNA revolution. New technology suddenly made it possible to process full genomes quickly and cheaply, letting scientists analyze hundreds of ancient individuals and publish a flood of groundbreaking studies. That new data showed that the first European farmers were genetically different from the local Mesolithic groups. They were descended from Anatolian farmers who expanded throughout Europe over many generations. But, as usual, the real story turned out to be more complicated than that. As these Anatolian farming communities spread from the Aegean into Europe, they mixed with the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers they encountered along the way. Agriculture has a major advantage. It supports much larger populations than most hunter-gatherer lifestyles can sustain. So in Neolithic Europe, these mixed groups were genetically dominated by Anatolian farmer ancestry, with only a smaller portion coming from hunter-gatherers. Take the linear pottery culture, known as LBK from the German linear Bandkeramic in Central Europe. These people were mostly descended from Anatolian farmers but still carried about 5% WHG ancestry on average. Interestingly, it seems that the development of LBK as its own culture around 5500 BC was sparked by interactions between the farmers and the local hunter-gatherers. Some of the earliest LBK individuals had nearly 11% WHG ancestry, which is about the same as having a single WHG great-grandparent. And a few early LBK samples show even higher proportions, 35%, even 50% WHG ancestry, which is exactly what you'd expect if someone had one hunter-gatherer parent and one Neolithic farmer parent. The merging of these groups created a unique society. Still fundamentally Neolithic farmers, but distinct from the earlier Starcevo culture, which had been almost entirely Anatolian in origin. Over time, the WHG ancestry among LBK descendants settled down to roughly 5%. So what I'm getting at is this. Even though the hunter-gatherer lifestyle in that region eventually disappeared with the arrival of farming, those people still contributed both their culture and their DNA to the societies that absorbed them. And I think it's important to remember that long before the big WHG resurgence we'll eventually get to, Europe's Neolithic farmers were already partly descended from the hunter-gatherers who lived there first. Similar mixing happened as Neolithic people moved along the Mediterranean coastlines, blending, sometimes lightly, sometimes a bit more, with WHG groups and forming new cultures like the Cardial Ware culture. There were continued episodes of mixing over the centuries, but overall, these two ways of life, farmers and hunter-gatherers, mostly stayed separate. Part of that was simple numbers. Hunter-gatherer groups were usually small, but just as important, they gravitated toward different landscapes. Farmers focused on fertile river valleys with the right soils for crops, while hunter-fisher-foragers moved seasonally between resource-rich zones, places like coastlines, wetlands, forests, and uplands. Archaeology shows us that farmers and hunter-gatherers often lived surprisingly close to one another. Yet in many places they seem to barely interact at all. In some regions, maybe there were moments of tension or outright conflict, and in others they might have simply kept their distance and gone about their own lives. And honestly, this is the kind of thing that pulls me in the most. I can't help imagining the thousands of little encounters that must have taken place over the centuries. How these two very different groups saw one another, how they reacted, what they feared, and what they might have admired. Usually, all we get are tiny clues. Take domesticated pig bones, for example. Sometimes they show up in Mesolithic hunter-gatherer sites. But figuring out what that really means is tricky. Did the hunter-gatherers trade for pork or live pigs? Did they steal them during raids? Or did they actually start raising pigs themselves for a short time? There's no clear answer, but it definitely sparks the imagination. Genetic evidence mostly shows small amounts of hunter-gatherer ancestry slipping into farming communities now and then. But genetics can't tell us how that mixing actually happened. So we have to assume a range of possibilities, some marriages, some hunters joining farming groups by choice, and likely some darker events too. In reality, not all of this mixing would have been peaceful. Some of it probably involved abductions after raids, sexual violence, forced assimilation, maybe even forms of slavery or other kinds of unequal social absorption. And we do see signs of conflict in certain areas. In the northern and western edges of LBK territory, for instance, some farmers built fortified enclosures. Based on wounds found on skeletons, these defenses were mostly meant to fend off raids from other farming groups. But the density of these forts in frontier zones suggests they were also nervous about the hunter-gatherers living just beyond their borders. LBK farmers never managed to expand all the way to the North Sea or the Baltic coasts. In those coastal regions, hunter-fisher foragers maintained stronger populations because the sea and rivers provided incredibly rich resources. Between the farmers and the foragers, a kind of empty buffer zone developed, almost like a no-man's land where neither culture really settled. And what's remarkable is that this situation held steady for roughly 1,000 years. Then, after about 5000 BC, LBK culture began to collapse for reasons that weren't simple and probably involved a lot of factors. The breakdown turned violent. There were massacres, populations shrank, and long-distance trade networks fell apart. Cultural connections that once tied communities together became fractured. In the aftermath, Neolithic societies in Central Europe splintered into more regional, distinct cultures. And in northwestern Europe, the two main branches of Neolithic farmers blended again when the Cardial-Ware groups from the Mediterranean pushed north through France, eventually displacing or merging with post-LBK communities. And then, right around 4400 BC, something really interesting shows up in the record. Hunter-gatherer influence begins spreading into some of these Neolithic groups. We suddenly see a noticeable jump in WHG ancestry, along with the striking replacement of many Neolithic farmer male lineages by hunter-gatherer ones. Down in Iberia, Mesolithic groups hung on, especially along the Atlantic coast, long after the Neolithic farmers arrived. They lasted for roughly 500 years after farming reached the peninsula. And after around 4500 BC, we start to see hunter-gatherer ancestry rising within Iberia's Neolithic communities. That lines up almost perfectly with the rise of WHG ancestry around 4400 BC in Central Europe, where it jumped to somewhere between 15% and 40%, and in a few individuals even climbed past 50%. Along with that overall ancestry increase, we also see growth in both male and female WHG genetic lineages. And this brings me to what I think is the most important detail. If you look at Y chromosome haplogroups, basically markers passed directly from fathers to sons, you see hunter-gatherer lineages appearing right inside these farming populations. A Y haplogroup by itself doesn't mean ethnicity. Of course, it's simply a marker that helps us trace lineages and migrations. Up until this point, most Neolithic farmers carried Y haplogroups like G2A, which came from Anatolia. But then those begin to disappear and get replaced by WHG haplogroups, especially I2A. In some regions, as much as half of the Anatolian male lineages were replaced by WHG ones. And in some local cultures across northern and western Europe, the replacement looks like it reached nearly 100%. Mitochondrial haplogroups, which mothers pass down to their children, mostly continued as before, though we do see some increase in WHG female lines too. But overall, the pattern is pretty clear. This resurgence, the rise in WHG ancestry within Neolithic farming communities, was heavily biased toward males. The hunter-gatherer resurgence didn't happen everywhere. In places that had been heavily settled for a long time, like Greece, the Balkans, and Croatia, there probably just weren't many hunter-gatherer groups left to mix with. But in Central Europe, where WHG ancestry started rising again, a whole set of new cultures appeared. These were farming communities moving into fresh environments that had previously been occupied mainly by hunter-gatherers. And these new groups were themselves mixtures, Central European Neolithic farmers who already carried ancient hunter-gatherer ancestry, Mediterranean Neolithic farmers who also had WHG roots, and on top of that, new admixture from the last remaining local hunter-gatherers. These blended societies were extremely successful. Over the course of generations, they kept moving outward until they reached the Atlantic coast, the Baltic, the North Sea, and even the English Channel. And after 4000 BC, some of these groups crossed the water and began settling in Britain and Ireland. Once again, they outcompeted and in a sense absorbed the hunter-gatherer groups still living there. What's striking is that almost every Neolithic male who settled Britain and Ireland, aside from a couple rare cases in Ireland, carried the WHG I2AY haplogroup. So that leads to the big question: how did these late-surviving hunter-gatherer groups end up taking over so much of the Neolithic gene pool? At first glance, it almost looks like a series of small-scale conquests happening over a few generations, hunter-gatherer men sweeping in, killing many of the Neolithic farmer men, and taking over their communities. But the strange thing is, even though the genetics suggest something dramatic happened, we don't actually have any solid archaeological evidence of mass killings from this time. There aren't massacre sites showing Neolithic men cut down by hunter-gatherer-style weapons. And frankly, Neolithic men weren't exactly defenseless. These guys knew how to fight. They had maces, axes, adzes, bows, plenty of weapons, and they were used to battling each other. Many of them lived in fortified settlements or enclosed sites built for defense. So the idea that hunter-gatherers just steamrolled these well-armed farming societies doesn't quite add up. Maybe the farming groups had already been weakened by the time this happened. They might have struggled with local population pressure, overused resources, outbreaks of disease, or even destructive cycles of conflict as groups fought one another for what was left. A major climate downturn around 4500 BC might have been a huge part of this as well. Temperatures dropped, soils got wetter, and the North Atlantic region saw stronger winds and more storms. If farming communities collapsed in large numbers under these stresses, they would have been easy targets for raids or pressure from neighboring hunter-gatherer groups. But here's the interesting twist. In this hypothetical situation, the hunter-gatherers who raided them didn't just grab farmer women and run back to their coastal or forested homelands to keep living the same lifestyle. Instead, they moved into these Neolithic communities, took over leadership or male roles, and became farmers themselves. That's not the obvious choice, especially if these villages were struggling. But geneticists remind us that replacing male lineages doesn't automatically mean the farmer men were all killed. It just means the incoming men reproduced more successfully over time. Still, it's pretty hard to picture how that plays out without at least some level of violence or coercion. But maybe the conquest idea isn't the whole story. You can imagine a situation where both sides were struggling, farmers dealing with famine and conflict, hunter-gatherers hit by disease, and eventually the two groups built some kind of mutual arrangement. Maybe they exchanged support during hard times, defended one another from enemies, shared hunting or farming territories, or even arranged marriages as a way to survive changing conditions. It's also very possible that the worsening climate hurt the farmers more severely than the hunter-gatherers. If your crops fail, your whole world collapses. But hunter-gatherers, who were used to shifting between forest, wetland, and coastal resources, might have been more resilient. Their traditional skills, tracking game, gathering plants, fishing, adapting quickly, could suddenly become incredibly valuable when farming no longer guaranteed survival. On top of all that, some WHG groups thriving in woodlands, marshes, and uplands may have simply adopted farming themselves. They might have brought in women from farming groups, picked up the basic agricultural techniques, and then adapted those techniques to the environments they already knew so well. Archaeology backs this up. Across regions stretching from Belgium to the Alps, we start to see new kinds of landscapes. places once occupied only by hunter-gatherers, being farmed for the first time after about 4400 BC. And during this period, several new archaeological cultures emerge, all showing higher WHG ancestry and the I2AY haplogroup. One example is the Michelsberg culture, covering parts of modern Germany, France, and Belgium. These folks didn't farm the way earlier LBK groups did. Instead of building huge longhouses and staying in one place for generations while carefully manuring the fields, the Michelsberg people practiced a more mobile slash-and-burn approach, clearing forest patches, farming the soil for a few seasons, and then moving on when fertility dropped. Their homes were often simpler and more short-lived, reflecting a lifestyle that blended farming with older, more flexible habits. Once land had been cleared and fresh secondary forests grew back, people turned those areas into grazing land for their cattle. That shift slowly transformed Europe's ancient oak and elm woodlands into mixed forest pastures filled with hazel, alder, birch, and ash. Alongside this, these new Central European cultures built enormous fortified enclosures, likely overseen by powerful elites, as well as huge burial monuments made from earth and stone. And as the climate warmed again after 4000 BC, these cultures spread even farther. The funnel beaker culture, which grew out of the Michelsberg tradition, pushed northward into what's now southern Scandinavia. At roughly the same time, the first real colonization of Britain and Ireland began. These settlers carried with them that increasing WHG ancestry and the I2AY haplogroup lineages. Some researchers have suggested that this surge of hunter-gatherer influence might have been what made the colonization of these far northern areas possible. WHG groups had spent thousands of years navigating the waters of the Baltic, so their boat-building and maritime experience may have been essential for the funnel beaker expansions and the crossing into Britain and Ireland. It's completely possible that these newer societies were also speaking languages rooted in WHG traditions. Now, that isn't always what happens when populations mix, historically speaking, but if the male lineages came mostly from WHG ancestors, it's not hard to imagine they may have carried their languages with them too. Some people also believe that the Neolithic megalithic tradition, the building of standing stones, earth mounds, and those massive stone tombs, may trace all the way back to Mesolithic communities. Perhaps it developed from the meeting and merging of Southern European farmers, Central European farmers, and local hunter-gatherer groups. To me, it's fascinating to think that the builders of places like Stonehenge might have been only around 20% WHG by ancestry, but could still have been speaking languages descended from their Mesolithic forebears. And then, after roughly 3000 BC, everything began to shift again. These Central and Western European societies were gradually transformed, and in many cases replaced, by people arriving from the East. The corded ware culture, carrying their Western steppe herder ancestry. But even the corded ware groups weren't some entirely separate population. They carried WHG ancestry too, especially after mixing with Neolithic European cultures like the globular amphora culture. And there were later waves of WHG ancestry as well, including a migration from the Baltic around 2200 BC that helped shape the Anetis culture. The classic WHG-Y haplogroup, I2A, still survives today, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, and people of European descent continue to carry a noticeable amount of Mesolithic hunter-gatherer DNA. And I think it's time we rethink that old idea that Neolithic farmers from Anatolia swept into Europe and completely erased the Mesolithic peoples living here. Yes, it was absolutely a devastating time for many individuals and groups. Their lands were taken by incoming farmers, probably sometimes in violent ways, and they may have suffered from new diseases brought in from abroad. And without question, a lot of the earliest mixing between these communities wasn't voluntary at all. But the Mesolithic Europeans weren't simply passive victims, and they weren't wiped off the map. They survived for generations in marginal lands and across the frontier, sometimes raiding or trading or learning from the farmers. And it's important to remember that the farmers themselves already carried some hunter-gatherer ancestry, which may have made communication and cultural blending a little easier. Over time, as the climate shifted for centuries, Mesolithic groups watched the farming communities weaken, break apart, and scatter. And when the moment came, some hunter-gatherers likely moved in and took advantage of those weaknesses, maybe taking over entire villages, or perhaps the two groups joined forces and reinvented how to live in a changing world. From that crisis, powerful leaders emerged, building massive monuments to protect the living and honor the dead. These societies went on to expand into lands that had never been farmed before and built tens of thousands of monuments, many of which are still standing today. So I don't see the story of Europe's Mesolithic people as one of simple defeat or disappearance, even if their old lifestyle eventually faded away. To me, it's a story of remarkable endurance, a long struggle marked by resilience, adaptation, and ultimately resurgence. Thanks again to MyHeritage for sponsoring the video. If you're curious about discovering your own ancient ancestry and want to support my channel at the same time, just follow the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen. And don't forget to use my coupon code DAN25 to get your DNA kit at this special limited time price. Thank you so much to my patrons and channel members for your support. And if you want to learn more about the Neolithic colonization of Central Europe, check out my video on the LBK culture and their incredible longhouses, structures that, around 5000 BC, were the largest buildings the world had ever seen. Thanks for watching.